The sun hadn't even reached its highest point yet, and already the sand was too hot to touch. A woman knelt at the edge of a mud brick village near the Nile, pressing wet linen against her child's forehead. Around her, the fields shimmered like water that wasn't really there. Somewhere beyond the riverbank, the desert stretched out flat and merciless, a place where the temperature could climb past 50 degrees Celsius by early afternoon. And yet, less than a mile from where she knelt, entire cities were rising out of that same furnace. Stone temples, royal tombs, palaces with painted walls, and cool, shaded courtyards. People weren't just surviving here. They were building one of the greatest civilizations in human history, in a place that by every reasonable measure should have killed them first. That's the part that doesn't add up. Ancient Egypt sat inside one of the most punishing climates on Earth, decades before refrigeration, centuries before anyone understood what heat stroke actually did to the human body. No electricity, no modern medicine, just sun, sand, and a river that flooded on its own schedule. So how did a civilization not only endure that heat, but turn it into the foundation of an empire that lasted 3,000 years? To understand that, you have to go back before the pyramids, before the pharaohs, before anyone carved a single hieroglyph into stone. You have to go back to a version of North Africa that looked nothing like the desert we picture today. Around 10,000 years ago, the Sahara wasn't a wasteland. It was green. Lakes dotted the landscape, grasslands rolled toward the horizon, and herds of antelope and giraffe graze where sand dunes now sit in silence. Early human communities lived scattered across this entire region, following water and game the way people had for tens of thousands of years. Then, slowly, the climate shifted. Rain patterns that had sustained the Sahara for millennia began to fail. Over the course of centuries, not decades, the green landscape dried out, and the people living there faced an impossible choice: adapt or disappear. Most of that ancient population didn't stay to fight the changing climate. They moved. And where did thousands of displaced communities converge, generation after generation, as the Sahara dried around them? A single narrow ribbon of water cutting through the desert floor: the Nile. Here's the strange part. The very thing that should have made Egypt uninhabitable, an unforgiving desert climate, is exactly what forced human ingenuity into overdrive. Because when a river is the only reliable water source in 1,000 miles of sand, every decision about where to build, when to farm, and how to survive the hottest hours of the day becomes a matter of life and death. Egypt wasn't built despite the desert. In many ways, it was built because of it. The Nile flooded every year with astonishing predictability, driven by monsoon rains far to the south in the Ethiopian highlands. Egyptian farmers didn't need modern hydrology to understand the pattern. They learned to read the river like a calendar, timing their planting to the flood's retreat when the water left behind a dark, mineral-rich silt that could grow crops in soil that would otherwise have been barren desert dust. Ancient Greek historian Herodotus later called Egypt the gift of the Nile, and archaeological evidence backs that up almost perfectly. Without the river's flooding cycle, none of what came next would have been possible. But surviving the desert took more than farming near water. It took redesigning daily life around the sun itself. Archaeologists studying the remains of ancient Egyptian towns, including sites like Deir el-Medina, the village that housed the workers who built the tombs in the Valley of the Kings, have found something remarkable. These homes weren't randomly arranged. They were engineered for heat survival. Thick mud brick walls, sometimes over half a meter deep, absorbed the sun's heat slowly during the day and released it gradually at night, keeping interiors dramatically cooler than the air outside. Small, high windows limited direct sunlight while still allowing airflow. Flat rooftops became living spaces after sundown, where families slept under the stars once a desert finally released its grip on the temperature. And then there's the workday itself. Records and entomb inscriptions from Deir el-Medina show something that modern office culture would call radical. The ancient Egyptians appear to have practiced a version of the siesta, thousands of years before the word existed. Laborers worked in the cooler morning hours, paused during the punishing midday heat, and resumed again as the sun began to fall. This wasn't laziness, it was survival engineering, built directly into the rhythm of an entire civilization. But here's where it gets even more interesting. The body itself had to adapt.
Modern researchers studying heat physiology have found that populations living for many generations in extreme desert environments develop measurable biological advantages: more efficient sweating, better heat dissipation, a tolerance threshold that shifts higher than populations from cooler climates. While direct genetic studies on ancient Egyptian remains are limited compared to research on other desert populations, bioarchaeologists examining skeletal remains from Egyptian burial sites have noted patterns consistent with long-term adaptation to chronic heat stress, including bone density and growth markers that suggest bodies under sustained environmental pressure across generations. Survival in this climate wasn't only cultural, it was, quite literally, written into the people themselves. Then there was water, and what the Egyptians did with it went far beyond simply drinking it. Wells discovered at ancient sites show sophisticated understanding of groundwater access. Some dug remarkably deep to reach stable water tables even during dry seasons. Egyptians also developed early irrigation channels, allowing them to control water distribution rather than relying entirely on the flood's natural spread. This meant food security even in years when the Nile's flood came in weaker than expected, and weak floods happened. Historical records and geological data show multiple periods of Nile flood failure throughout Egyptian history, some severe enough to trigger the kind of famine that toppled entire dynasties. The Old Kingdom's collapse around 2200 BCE has been linked by climate scientists to a prolonged period of drought and diminished Nile flooding, evidence pulled from sediment cores and isotope analysis that reveals just how tightly Egyptian civilization was bound to the whims of water in a land otherwise defined by its absence. Clothing tells its own story too. Egyptians favored lightweight linen, woven from flax grown along the Nile's fertile banks, breathable and light-colored to reflect rather than absorb the sun's punishing rays. Wealthier Egyptians wore intricate pleated linens, but even laborers wore simple wrapped garments, designed with the same principle: let air move, keep the sun out. Compare that to the heavy wool and animal hide clothing common in cooler ancient societies, and you start to see just how specifically Egyptian material culture was shaped by its environment. And then, everything changed again, because the Egyptians didn't just adapt to the desert, they began to see it as sacred. The sun that could kill a person in hours without shelter or water became the center of Egyptian religion. Ra, the sun god, wasn't feared as a destroyer. He was worshipped as the very source of life, sailing across the sky each day and through the underworld each night, dying and being reborn in an endless cycle. It's a striking psychological shift. A civilization living under one of the most dangerous suns on Earth chose not to curse it, but to build their entire cosmology around it. The heat that threatened their lives became proof of divine order. That relationship with the desert also shaped how Egyptians treated death itself. The same dry, brutal climate that made daily survival difficult turned out to be extraordinarily good at preserving bodies. Early Egyptian burials, simple pits dug directly into hot desert sand, naturally desiccated the dead through rapid moisture loss, a process modern forensic archaeologists have replicated experimentally to understand how effective this passive mummification really was. Long before elaborate embalming rituals developed, the desert itself was already doing the preserving. Egyptians noticed, and what began as an accident of climate eventually evolved into one of the most iconic religious practices in human history: intentional mummification, an attempt to recreate, through ritual and resin, what the sand had been doing on its own for centuries. So the desert wasn't just an obstacle the Egyptians overcame. It shaped their architecture, their daily schedules, their bodies, their clothing, their agriculture, their religion, and even their understanding of what happens after death. Nearly every defining feature of ancient Egyptian civilization, the thing we now recognize instantly across thousands of years of history, traces back to a single brutal environmental fact: they lived somewhere that should have been unlivable. And this story isn't finished. It's still playing out right now. Modern engineers and architects working in extreme heat regions, from Phoenix to Dubai to Cairo itself, have increasingly turned back to ancient building principles once dismissed as primitive. Thick, thermally massive walls, small, strategically placed windows, courtyard designs that trap cool air, Passive cooling techniques, first developed by people without a single power tool, are now being studied as solutions to a climate crisis that's pushing temperatures higher across the globe. In a strange twist of history, the same adaptations that let ancient Egyptians survive their desert may end up helping modern cities survive theirs. Climate scientists warn that vast regions of the planet are trending toward temperatures the human body was never designed to handle for extended periods. And somewhere in that data is a quiet, remarkable fact. Thousands of years ago, in a river valley surrounded by nothing but heat and sand, a group of people didn't just find a way to live. They built pyramids that still stand. They built a religion that shaped the ancient world. They built a way of life so resilient that pieces of it are being studied today in labs and architecture firms by people trying to solve the very same problem all over again. That woman kneeling by the Nile, pressing wet linen to her child's forehead beneath a sky that offered no mercy, had no idea her descendants would build an empire that outlasted almost every civilization that came after it. She just knew she had to survive the afternoon. And somehow, generation after generation, that's exactly what they did, until surviving the desert became something else entirely. It became civilization itself.